Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 34 of On the Road with AutoTrader, where we make car stuff simple for Canadians. My name is Jodi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of AutoTrader.
And I am Dan Alika. I am AutoTrader's road test editor.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, Jodi. Before we start this episode, I want to say we've talked about rules of the road a lot, like, ones that you should know, ones that are kind of unwritten but you should respect. I want to say the other day I was driving to my video shoot for a recent car review. It was the Nissan Ariya.
Cool.
And I was driving up the highway, and there was a guy who was in the center lane, and he was doing like 105 kilometers an hour in a 100 zone. It's like, yeah, that's slower than most people are driving on the 401 these days, let's be honest. But he wasn't doing anything illegal. And a guy came flying up behind him and was flashing his high beams at this guy. And I just want to say, I don't love that in the fast lane. That's a very European thing, and it works. Here, people get offended by it, right? So it's like, I think it's one of those proceed with caution. It's supposed to be just a little warning, like, hey, I'm behind you, get out of the way.
Yeah, but you can use the left lane for passing.
Exactly. This guy, it really, really bothered me that this guy had the nerve to do that to someone. I get it, you're impatient. But
just pass.
That's not that guy's problem.
Yeah.
That's your problem. So anyways, don't do that. This episode is not about rules of the road, but this just happened the other day, and it really irked me. So I wanted to use it as kind of like a little, reminder to all of you out there. Patience is a virtue. The left lane is for passing. Don't be a jerk.
Thanks, Dan. That's a good reminder for everyone. Every time I go out for a drive, I am so annoyed by all the stuff that I see. And this kind of leads into our conversation today because I was just on vacation last week. We rented a cottage up in Bruce's Peninsula. Which I mistakenly called Bruce's Peninsula because my cat is named Bruce, so it's just funnier that way.
It was very, like, you said it with so much confidence. Oh yeah, I'm heading out to Bruce's Peninsula. And all of us in the room, like, looked at you like, what is this lady talking
I say
about?
things weird. Dan roasts me all the time for saying stuff weird. Supermarket, soda. I know, whatever. But anyway, it's a small town, and the drivers up there were so polite and so courteous. And then I came back into the city, and I was enraged by everyone who was being so rude and impatient. But while I was on vacation there, I randomly stumbled onto this like vintage car show.
Very cool.
And there were all of these amazing cars from like a whole bunch of different eras, but the ones that stood out to me the most were the ones from the 1950s because of those tail fins and like all the chrome and those amazing design details.
Any particular ones?
There was a DeSoto Adventurer.
Not to be confused with a DeSoda. Hey, can you pass me a DeSoda? Anyways.
Thanks, Dan. But anyway, this was just a beautiful car, and like, I don't want to sound like an old person, but they don't make them like that anymore.
I mean, it's true.
And it was beautiful, and it got me thinking about like design trends of today, because the 1950s were such an easy era to define in terms of design.
Yeah.
And I thought about today, like, is it that easy today?
No. To get to that answer, no. The other thing is, I think it's true, pretty broadly, like the shapes of cars back then really seemed to be influenced by trains and planes. So they were all like big and bulgy. But, if you look at like American design, that was like the big blinged out chrome, and tail fins and all that stuff. And if you look at like Japanese design and European design, it was very different, except for kind of the overall shapes of cars. For the most part, tended to be similar no matter where you were looking.
Yeah, and I think, just going back to the 1950s, everything was inspired by the obsession with space, going to the moon, all that kind of stuff. Even architecture looked a lot like the cars. Yeah. There's a style of architecture called Googie architecture, which is, I know it's a funny word, but it's such a beautiful design aesthetic, and I really appreciate it.
Did you know that term, or did you have to Googie it? Wow,
Dan's on a roll today.
Terrible. Joseph, our producer, is stifling a laugh, which makes me feel pretty good.
But he's also shaking his head because that was such a bad dad joke.
Anyways, let's get back.
I haven't seen Dan for a week because I've been on vacation, so he's trying extra hard to like annoy me today. But anyway, so in today's episode, we're going to be talking about like the biggest design trends of today's vehicles and where we kind of see it going in the next like 5 years or so. And one of the biggest design trends that I've noticed is the obsession with massive grills.
Yeah, it's a little over the top.
Yeah, and I think this started a couple years ago, but all of a sudden, automakers, especially luxury automakers, started putting these enormous grills that took up the whole front end of their vehicles. BMW is guilty of this, Lexus,
those
even Toyota.
BMW grills, I'm sorry, we've got to say it, like whoever decided that they were going to take what was a pretty, I would say like a pretty iconic grill design, that kidney-shaped grill, and it was always kind of tasteful, and turn it into these monstrosities, these buck teeth. They're hideous. And then when the public reaction was like, oh, yikes, and BMW went like, not enough.
Hold my beer.
Yeah,
gonna make it bigger.
It is outrageous. I'm all for daring design. I think like the Hyundai group, so Hyundai, Genesis, and Kia, are really sort of leading the way in terms of taking risks with design. Not all of it works, but also none of it has been as outlandish as those. I don't even call them kidneys anymore. They're literally, I've said this before, I've said it in videos, I've written it in reviews. Go ahead and take a look at Bette Midler in what was that movie
Halloween movie?
Yeah. I can't remember the name of it now.
I know the one you're talking about, but at Dan's point is that all of BMW's grills look like buck teeth.
It's terrible.
But it's funny what you said about Kia, Hyundai, and Genesis, because basically they kind of hired all of the German automakers' best designers. And so I actually get the chance to speak to them sometimes. And a lot of times they're like, yeah, it's so much fun to design for these brands because we're not held back by all of that history and all of those design cues that they absolutely must have. And so they're allowed to be much more experimental.
Wait, Hocus Pocus.
Yes, that's the
one. No, you're right. I mean, and Genesis is a really good example of that because that brand is so young. Like it's 6 years old now.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, when you talk to their design team, they get to kind of do whatever. They have that classic, like there's no outrageous, nothing's too crazy to try.
Yeah.
Because they're just like, well, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But it's great to be able to experiment and see what.
And I like that scrappy kind of attitude when it comes to design. I think really exciting things can come out of designs when designers are given like the freedom to experiment, and I love that.
Wait, there's a word you say weird.
What?
Experiment.
How do you say it?
Experiment.
I also say laboratory.
Jodi deep down wishes that she was British a little bit.
I don't think so. I
do.
I feel like maybe it's because I watched a lot of British television growing up.
What about Dexter's Lab?
Dexter's Laboratory.
And he would say laboratory. Anyways. I do think, and then another one that I was thinking about recently, and I mentioned to you earlier, was Toyota has this reputation for being, boring and sleepy and for the olds. But if you take a look, especially, you're right, like in the last, let's say 7 years or so, some of the designs that Toyota has churned out are very underrated in my opinion.
Absolutely. I remember when the current generation of Camry came out.
It's so cool.
It was really crazy for the time.
Yeah.
And in their press releases and talking to their designers and stuff, they went as far to call it sexy, which has never before been used to describe a Toyota. And so I thought that was really bold.
Except I mean, the 2000 GT. That was a sexy Toyota.
Beautiful.
But yeah, like in terms of sedans, especially if you look at like whatever that generation of kind of like late 90s, early 2000s Camry.
And they were all gold.
That thing was just like a blob.
Yeah.
It was really reliable, but it was not sexy. And then you look at the current Camry, and it looks really cool. The Sienna.
Yeah,
looks
Sienna
really cool.
looks great. It also has a big grille, but it somehow works because of the proportions of that minivan. It just works. And I think why Toyota's designs are so underrated today, like you said, is because they're obviously extremely popular vehicles. And so we see them everywhere.
Yeah.
And so that initial punch kind of wears out the longer they're on the road.
They're not as like controversial because it's like, oh, 50,000 of these RAV4s were sold in Canada this year. It's like suddenly you're not as taken aback by it, right?
But it looks cool, and they're coming out with a whole bunch of other really cool stuff too. Like they're gonna come out with a new Land Cruiser.
Yeah.
And it's gonna look sick.
Yeah, those teaser images. I don't know if we'll see if the official images will be out by the time this airs. If they are, we'll go ahead and throw them up. If not, you guys got to check it out. Go to autotrader.ca/editorial. Check out this new Land Cruiser because the teaser makes it seem like really retro inspired, which you said to me is another trend that we're seeing these days.
Absolutely. So I think one of the first vehicles that kind of tipped the tide on this trend was the Ioniq 5.
Yeah.
Right? And so when they came out with the concept for that, it was inspired by the original Hyundai Pony from the 80s.
Yeah, so and that's like a whole story, and Hyundai's designers worked with the original designers because so the one that was really the kind of pony coupe concept inspired car was that N74
that thing
Heritage.
was so cool.
Super cool, but yeah, the front end of that Ioniq 5 kind of took inspiration from the original Pony, which was a hatchback, and that was kind of the first Hyundai that you could buy in North America.
Right.
And those pixel lights really give it this like 80s video game vibe.
But even just the boxiness of it was so cool, right? And this retro design I am absolutely loving. Like I said, I'm obsessed with vintage stuff and like old cars, and even the Volkswagen ID Buzz that's coming out. It is so influenced by the original microbus.
Yeah.
And I love to see automakers going back to their like original models and their original designs to pay homage to them, but then like modernizing them in a way that will make it even more appealing.
And to me, it's so much different than in the 90s when the new Beetle. The Volkswagen new Beetle came out. Obviously, that was leaning into the heritage of the Beetle, but like it looked nothing like the original. Just in terms of like the three bubble design.
The basic silhouette was the same, but everything else was different.
If you take a look at the ID Buzz, it just looks like a modern day version of the original.
Like a loaf of bread.
Yeah, if Volkswagen never stopped building that van, this is like the progression, that design progression, and it's super cool. And that's what Hyundai, it felt like Hyundai accomplished with the Ioniq 5. If the Pony stayed the same, and existed from the 80s all the way through until today, I feel like this is and car design didn't change back into swoopy and more aerodynamic styling. This is what it would look like. But speaking of aerodynamics, that has obviously always played, a key role in automotive design, but with electrification, it's an even bigger deal.
Yeah, and so electrification is really, really changing how car designers are approaching car design, mainly because they don't have the traditional things to take care of. Like, we don't need an engine in the front. What are we going to do with all of this new space that we have? So they can really push the envelope that way.
But I even mean from like a coefficient of drag perspective, right?
Look at the Hyundai Ioniq 6.
Which I guess is also an example of how daring and different, like most car companies, you'll see some commonality, right? Some like, some of that genealogy in the current design. Yeah, okay, not all of them are redesigned at or around the same time. So you have different kind of generational traits, and you have like, they may have cycled through like a head designer. So like their influence is no longer present. So you still see it in some of the older vehicles. But if you take a look, the Ioniq 5 and the Ioniq 6 are only 2 or 3 years apart, and they are entirely different vehicles except for the pixel, light.
Yeah, and so where the Ioniq 5 is like boxy and retro, the Ioniq 6 looks like a bar of soap. It is so smooth and it looks so I don't think it's a good-looking car.
No, neither do I.
But the reason for that shape is to improve aerodynamics, which will increase the range.
It's one of the most aerodynamically efficient cars on the market. So it's like, there's a couple, I think the Tesla Model S is a little bit more slippery. The Lucid Air, I believe, is another one that's up there. But I believe the North American version of the Ioniq 6 is like 0.22 coefficient of drag, which is super low. And the Korean and like some European markets have this one that's 0.21.
Wow.
And that's because they have camera door mirrors.
Oh, instead of regular
instead
side
of like
mirrors.
actual mirrors. And that's because wisely our government regulations don't allow for these cameras. But those create obviously a little bit of drag. So the score here is higher, but still the closer you get to that 0.20, like that's a really impressively low number. That's why the Ioniq 6, I'm going to go ahead and say it, is so ugly.
But it's super efficient, so it's kind of worth it.
And it's kind of cool around back. Like it's got that kind of like whale tail-esque spoiler. Mm-hmm. Like the back end looks kind of Porsche 911-esque. And I can't remember the guy's name, but speaking with the designer at the LA Auto Show last year, and he was saying like, because the back end of it comes to this really sharp point, and he said like they, as a designer, when he was working with the engineering team, it was like they could just kind of like make it as like if he could make that car, let's say like 40 feet long and just have that point come sharper and sharper and sharper, it would have lowered the coefficient of drag, right? Because that vortex generation, that's a problem. So he's like, that's why they brought it to that sharp point in the rear. But obviously there's a limit to how much you can,
Oh, and the other thing about EVs and electrification that's really changing how cars look is that we don't need grills anymore. There's no engine that needs to breathe, that needs air. And so you're seeing a lot more vehicles with just no grill. And that was really shocking at first to a lot of people.
It's also going to change the big grill look.
Absolutely.
You still have like BMW is just using these like plastic panels. Mercedes right now is big on these big black plastic panels instead of grills. But if you take a look at the Ioniq 6, the Ioniq 5, the Kia EV6, there are no grills. Yes, there are little cooling flaps in the lower bumper, but we're talking about where a traditional grill would exist kind of between the headlights. Those are gone. And so they're like microscopic. They're like little, not open, but they're like little mail slots.
Oh, they don't even count as grills.
No,
that's just
they're
vents.
They're panels, and then down below are these little vents. That's going to reverse the design trend of big grills.
Yeah, I think so too. And a kind of an interesting example of that are BMW's electric vehicles. So the iX, they still use that kidney grill, and it's very ugly, mind you. But it's those plastic panels. And now they hide all of their safety sensors behind there, which is kind of cool.
And it's kind of neat that the material itself is self-healing.
That's right.
So it's, think of it like a cutting mat that you might use, in like the art world if you're, cutting and sculpting or in like clothing. You'll have one of those cutting mats, and those are self-healing. Mm-hmm. So if you slice into it, the plastic will just kind of fill itself back in.
And that's important because if that's where all the safety sensors are, all of those scratches will affect how well those sensors work.
Exactly.
So if this material is self-healing, problem solved.
Yeah, it's very cool. And they're like heated so they can melt any ice and snow so that in the wintertime the sensors aren't obstructed. It's really cool, but it's, in BMW's case, is still very ugly.
It is still very ugly. I think the one on the XM looks a little bit better.
Yeah. And like, I guess, the what is it? The BMW M4 CSL.
Ooh, yeah, that looks good.
That thing looks cool because it's got those bars. And that's because it looks like a vintage race car. It makes it look like, the original CSL. so it works.
Yeah.
On every other one, it's just ugly.
Yeah, it's not so good.
Yeah.
Another big design trend we're seeing today is enormous wheels. So when I was driving that BMW XM, they were really hyped about the fact that it came with 23-inch wheels. And it was the first time you could ever get wheels that big on a BMW straight from the factory.
That is a classic case of, design leading the kind of parade, because no, engineer would say, oh, yes, let's put these massive wheels. Now, within reason, right? If you remember the BMW i3 was on those like 19-inch wheels.
Tiny wheels.
But they were like pizza cutters.
Yeah.
They were so thin. And that was good. The way that I'm not an engineer, but the way that the car responded to these big wheels that were super narrow worked for efficiency. Nowadays, I'm telling you, I think we're going to maybe see that trend reverse a little bit.
It has to, because with electrification, efficiency becomes so much more important.
Yeah.
And the downside with having extremely huge wheels is that they are a lot less efficient.
Yeah, they're just harder to turn, right? So now Porsche has, ironically, I'm driving the Taycan this week, and it's, I don't know, this one is on like 21s, I think. The wheels fill out the wheel wells really nicely, and Porsche's gone with these like almost solid, like the spokes are so thick
for better aerodynamics.
So they're a little more efficient, but still, the rolling resistance, not like a tire, but it's just like, to get that moving, to generate that momentum takes more energy than a smaller wheel. Remember back in the day, like 14, 15, 16-inch wheels. I remember when 16s were like, oh man, you went with the big wheels.
16 is so small.
And now it's like there aren't even many cars left that ride on 16s as standard.
Like, I don't think there's any.
17 is kind of like, you can still get like, some like compact cars, some SUVs will ride like, I don't remember. I feel like 16s might be, you can get like the Wrangler Rubicon on 16s because then you can get bigger tires, right?
That makes sense.
But like from a design perspective, it's these guys saying, well, we don't want, these designers don't like the void, right? They want to ride on these big wheels. And if you look at automotive design, even back in the day, the wheels in the sketches that they did were always comically oversized because they wanted to get rid of that black space.
Yeah.
To them, it was ugly. And it ruined their work. It made the design look less appealing. But now it's turned into this just over the top. And I'll tell you right now, so my car rides on 16s, I believe.
Okay.
I dread the day that I have to replace, like any of you out there who are buying, 20-inch tires for your trucks, like what I'm talking about. $1,000 plus per tire.
That's insane.
I'm sorry, but I just don't. That is a waste.
I mean, and that's one of the things you have to consider if you want to get bigger wheels is that they're going to be more expensive to replace one day and they're less efficient. So you're burning more gas, etc. But another big design trend today is kind of weird because there's a lot of hidden exhausts and there's a lot of fake exhausts. And the fake one really, really gets me. So sometimes on a modern car, you'll see the rear bumper and they'll have like two squarish, holes that look like exhausts, but there's nothing there.
Yeah.
They're fake panels.
Yeah.
And so that really annoyed me because I'm like, that has no purpose.
Yeah, it's really, because I think like fundamentally exhaust, especially if you look at, premium vehicles and performance vehicles, that's associated with performance, right? Oh, these tailpipes, that indicates that this vehicle is loud and it's fast and whatever. So this move to like BMW was really, it's hilarious. If you took a look at like, an older X3, I remember the first time I noticed it, I was like sitting at a light and my car was much lower and I noticed these two fake exhaust pipes. And then the actual like exhaust pipes inside of them, the one on the driver's side wasn't even functional. Like the one inside, it was silver And then the other side you could see was black and it went all the way through. And I find that so strange, but it's also what I think, right? It's affordability, because an actual full metal exhaust system with tailpipes attached to the end is expensive.
It's very expensive.
Something ornate that looks cool. Whereas if you can mold that directly into the bumper and then just have these, ugly little tailpipes like pop into those.
That's such a pet peeve of mine. I think that's one of the design trends today that I just really don't like. Like fake anything. Like sometimes performance cars will have fake vents everywhere. Yeah. And they look cool, but you get closer and it's like blocked off. So what's the point? Why not just make it a real vent?
Yeah.
It's so silly.
Well, but I mean, honestly, the big reason why is because of, efficiency.
I know, but if it's a performance car, who cares?
Well, because they have to have fleet emissions average, right? So it's like if I remember, I'll tell you guys a story. This is true. When I worked at Subaru, and we were bringing back the turbocharged Legacy and Outback. So for a few years, you could get those. Remember, like there was the XT version, and there was like the Spec B Legacy, and super cool cars, and then they went away, and you could get a 2.5 liter 4-cylinder or a 3.6 liter 6-cylinder, and then the 6-cylinder was dropped because of emissions,
right?
And replaced with a 2.4 turbo, and everyone was really hyped. Oh, it's the Legacy GT, and I was like, okay, but if we're gonna do that, let's bring back a hood scoop.
The hood scoop, because it's iconic.
Yeah, but it was like it would have reduced the efficiency. And the coefficient of drag by just enough that across that fleet average it would have a significant impact. So my director at the time was like, look, we can chop one up and try to make it work like once, like on one of the fitting trial vehicles, but
just never came to
it will never be like they'll never go for it in Japan. They won't let us do this because it's going to affect our numbers.
I can see that. Yeah. I just think it looks so cool, but I'm very much a style over function person. So
now here's the other interesting like exhaust trend was, tailpipes were tailpipes. That was just a thing. And then when Dieselgate, which we talked about on a previous episode, is diesel dead? So Volkswagen's emissions cheating scandal that kind of rocked the whole industry, that suddenly started this trend of hiding the exhaust pipes. So if you take a look, brands like Audi, go figure, it's part of the Volkswagen group, the previous gen Honda Civic, if you notice on, obviously the SI model and the Type R, the exhaust was prevalent because, hey, this is a performance vehicle. But the kind of regular versions, the tailpipes were cut like vertically and were actually tucked under the bumper pointing straight down at the ground because all of a sudden it's like before, exhaust is cool, it means performance. Then it became, ew, exhaust is dirty and it's bad for the environment. So let's go ahead and hide those completely. Now, of course, this didn't span the entire industry, but you can take a look and see many cars from that kind of like 2016 through the last couple years. There are cars out on the road that the exhaust was completely obscured from view, and it was like a psychological thing.
Very cool.
Yeah.
If any of you have questions about design trends or wanted to point out some of the stuff that you've noticed, you can email us at expert@trader.ca.
And don't worry, because we are going to do another episode where we kind of go through, the history of automotive design, some iconic designs. This was just more about now. So I know we touched on the 1950s stuff. We're not, neglecting the rest of the generations of cars. There's been so many beautiful cars, but we want to make sure that they have kind of time to shine.
Cool. Thank you, Dan. And before today's Ask an Expert segment, here is a message from our overlords. Save time and money by using AutoTrader, Canada's most trusted place to buy and sell new and used cars. AutoTrader has the most cars, and one of the best features is price badging, so you can feel more confident that you're getting a good deal. So today's Ask an Expert comes from Andy, who we work with here at AutoTrader.
Yeah.
Hello, experts. Got a quick question for you. What's the deal with car sizes? I saw a Nissan Z car from the 80s the other day, and the thing is tiny compared to the behemoth SUVs that we're all forced to buy because small cars have been discontinued. Have automakers forgotten how big or small parking spaces actually are?
I mean, yes and no. I think ultimately it comes down to, safety or the perception of what's safe, right? Is like it's easier to pass, these more stringent crash regulations today with a larger vehicle that can absorb and disperse energy better than a smaller one. And don't get me wrong, like even the current Mazda MX-5 is a safe car, and it's much safer than the one that I owned, my first gen, but it's still, it doesn't have the occupant protection that you get even from, let's say, a Mazda 3, which is Mazda's compact car, and it's much bigger than like a Protege back in the day. That's just, the simple fact of it.
Yeah.
And then when you take a look at, I'll tell you again from experience working on the OEM side, when focus groups are conducted with current gen owners, when a vehicle is being redesigned, right, one of the top 3 responses is always, I like it, I want more space.
Yeah.
And that's why vehicles tend to get bigger with each passing generation. It's very rare that you see, static dimensions or especially smaller dimensions. It's always going to be bigger, sometimes marginally, sometimes just huge differences. If you take a look at a vehicle like the current gen Chevrolet Suburban and Tahoe, the GMC Yukon, and the Cadillac Escalade, those were made, now they are bigger dimensionally, but interior-wise, they got much bigger because GM finally got rid of the solid rear axle and went with independent rear suspension. And that created tons more room inside. That's not something that you can do with the average vehicle.
Right.
So when customer feedback is, hey, I love my fill in the blank, but I wish it had more room, they go, okay, well, let's do that. And then the other side of it is when you come out with something new, what do people always want? It's bigger, it's better,
yeah.
Right? So if you don't hit that, then people are like, yawn,
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point for a design episode, is that changing safety standards often changes how cars are designed as well. The reason we don't see tail fins and pointy headlights anymore is because you would impale somebody on a crash.
Same with pop-up headlights,
yeah.
Right? Those don't exist anymore. That's a safety thing. T-tops, those don't exist anymore. That's a safety thing because they can't, meet the roof crush standards. And then you might say, well, they can make convertibles, but if you take a look at, equivalent convertibles, they'll have these, they're actually kind of cool where they're like these prop rods that in a collision, a rollover collision, these metal rods will shoot up behind the passenger cell to keep it from crushing the occupants. Some of them, that's why if you look, remember the Mustang, like 2 generations ago, it came with that cool like hoop, like that roll hoop in the back. That again was to protect people. You can incorporate those into like T-top cars, the Targa, the Porsche 911 Targa, but that's crash protection. That silver hoop that you see, that's protecting you. Sure, it looks really good, but that is, that's form over function, or form combined really well with function.
Yeah, so safety is a huge driver for automotive design. Thank you, Andy, for your question. If any of you have questions you would like to ask Dan or I, you can email expert@trader.ca. Until next time, drive safe and please subscribe. We love you.
Bye, guys.